we're looking at first they said today was going to be a ceasefire, that Israel was going to cease all that, and that there was going to be some sort of a hostage exchange. And a lot of Americans and Europeans do not know that Israel has a lot of Palestinian women and children as well, and civilians in prison, and have been hostages as well. And so that there's a hostage exchange even being talked about. So could you go into a little bit about what's happening and where the ceasefire is now from the latest?
Actually, they agreed with the mediation of Qatar for cessation of hostilities for 4 days. I think it will start on Friday, and both sides will exchange some hostages. From the Israeli side, the numbers are still varying depending on the sources. Some sources say 150 Palestinian hostages. Other sources say around 400 Palestinian hostages that Israel must release from the prisons. People have to know that there are thousands of Palestinians. The numbers are around 5,000 Palestinians are held hostages in Israeli prisons, and I call them hostages because there are no proper judicial procedures for these people to be in prison to begin with, and many of them haven't received any sentences. They are in administrative courts, and they call it in administrative processes, and some of them are in military courts. And in the occupied territories, for example, let's speak about the West Bank. If you are from the West Bank, which is designated as a Palestinian territory under international law, if you are a child, you are 10 years old, and you threw a stone on an Israeli occupation soldier or an occupation tank or any vehicle, you could receive up to 20 years in jail in Israeli prisons. So Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself on Palestinian territories. If we're speaking about the West Bank, if we're speaking about East Jerusalem, they don't have the right to defend themselves. They have occupation forces, and this was clear by the UN rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, and she defined what self-defense means. Israel has the right, according to international law, to defend itself under territories designated as Israeli territories if Palestinians attack them on these territories. But as long as they have an occupation force, and we're speaking purely international law and UN Security Council resolutions, means Israel has to withdraw to the line of the 4th June 1967 war. After 1967 war, Israel occupied large swath of territories from Syria, from Palestine, from Lebanon, and back then also from Egypt. Egypt restored its Sinai due to the accords that were agreed upon between the both sides. Syria didn't restore its Golan Heights. Lebanese still have to restore their Shab'a farms. And on the Palestinian territories, even though Israel technically withdrew from some of these territories, but practically speaking, what they do is slowly grabbing these territories through the establishment or the construction of illegal settlements. The United States says these settlements are illegal. The European Union says the settlements are illegal. The UN says the settlements are illegal, but nobody can stop the construction of these settlements. So you have hundreds of thousands of new settlers came after 67 war, and they are living on Palestinian territories, and they have arms, and they are armed to teeth, and they are backed by the Israeli police and Israeli army, and they can just shoot and kill any Palestinian without receiving any sentence. And this has happened so many times there. Therefore, when the Palestinians try to defend themselves, this time because according to international law, they have the right to defend themselves on their territories, with a stone, they could receive 20 years in jail. And that's why we have hundreds of kids in in Israeli jails without any proper judicial system. And sorry to say, Israel doesn't have the right to prosecute Palestinians and hold them from Palestinian territories, take them to Israeli courts, and send them to jails there. This is all illegal. So Hamas, it will release now 50 hostages, which is, in my opinion, good news. And I'm very consistent in this. Women and children, they have no place in any prison, whether in Palestinian prison or in Hamas prison. These people are innocent. Okay, they shouldn't be in prison or prosecuted by any side. But the argument from the Palestinian side is, how are we going to free thousands of Palestinian hostages in Israeli jails? Israel will never give back them, never. And the experiences in the past, that Hezbollah, for example, captured 2 soldiers and then freed hundreds of hostages. Hamas, if we remember, this was 20 years ago, they captured 1 Israeli soldier and they were able to free many Palestinian hostages. So Israel proved in the past phase that the only way the Palestinians were able to free their prisoners and their hostages is through capturing Israelis. Negotiations never work. Mediations never work. Whether it's United States, whether it's Russia, whether it's Qatar, it never works. Israel would never give and free Palestinian hostages unless they want to exchange it. And that's why we have this brutal situation that Hamas waged this attack on the Israeli kibbutz, and they hold the hostages. The main goal of this operation was to hold as much as hostages they can so that they can free the Palestinian hostages. And I'm not giving justifications or excuses for Hamas. I myself am known that I dislike Hamas, and I've been attacking Hamas for quite a long time. I've been attacked by Al Jazeera because they like Hamas a lot for criticizing and attacking Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay, I have a question. I just have a question to interject right there. To the Western audience, all right, and I'm going to give you a perspective. Hamas is called a terrorist organization. Now, you'll notice that many nations in the world are supporting Palestinians and you know, the struggle that they are being occupied. Particularly, you know, you have Spain, South Africa, right, that just made their motion to close down the embassy, the Israeli embassy. You have Ireland that's been the Irish have been very outspoken because they the IRA was called a terrorist organization. And, you know, like some of my relatives would say, absolutely not, that's not a terrorist organization. That's a resistance organization that's been fighting British colonization. They're not terrorists. They're just being labeled that by Western Empire. So is that the same thing that is happening to Hamas? Have they been labeled terrorists when they're actually a resistance group? Or is it more nuanced than that? And would you like to kind of give your take on that?
Actually, the Palestinians, since the 60s, and when they resorted to armed resistance against the Israelis, whether they are left-wing groups, whether they are Marxist groups, whether they are communist groups, whether they are socialist groups, whether they are nationalist groups, they were all called terrorists by the Israeli side. Any armed activity against the Israeli occupation were painted as terrorist activities. And we have to remember that the Islamization of the armed struggle of the Palestinians only started in the early 90s. Before that, they were mostly left-wing, communist, socialist, and sometimes nationalist. But Israel, they had a hard time in painting the Palestinians as terrorists back then. Therefore, they helped the creation of Hamas in the late 80s because they wanted to create a rift among the Palestinians. And this is from the playbook of the Brits. The Brits, they have this, they call it a brilliant idea. In the early 1920s, they supported the Muslim Brotherhood, the spawn of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in order to create a rift in the Egyptian society among the lefties, the socialists, and the Islamists. Because back then, most of the resistance against the British occupation, and they call it a mandate of the countries in the region, they were from the left-wing scene and the nationalist scene. So they created an enemy for these resistance groups against the British occupation from the Islamists. So they started fighting each other. The same thing happened in Syria. The socialists came to power, the Pan-Arabists came to power, and they supported these Islamists to fight the other side. The same thing in Palestine. They supported the spawn of Hamas in the 80s because they wanted to first find an enemy for the PLO, an internal enemy, so that the Palestinians have their internal rift. And secondly, because it is easy by the mainstream definition that the Americans, of course, choose who is a terrorist and what is terrorism, to say that those are Islamist terrorists, for example. The definition of terrorism is the use of violence against civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in order to achieve political goals. And if we apply this on not only this Hamas, but also on other parties, the Israeli actions, the American actions, we can all call them terrorists then, because
Absolutely.
they're
Just
always
like the
sorting to.
American Empire and the British Empire. I mean, pretty much that's it. So I really wanted to make that point with you, because a lot of people, the Western narrative in the media is what people read. They don't read too much into it. They just read the words and the word terrorist. And I'm so glad that you brought this up to really define it, because actually the defining force here is American is supplying a lot of money to billions of dollars to Israel, right, for weapons. And then Israel is slaughtering women and children. 70% of the people that have been murdered and bombed are women and children.
Yes.
Not terrorists.
Yes.
So isn't America and Israel then terrorists? So we need to look at this. I mean, because
there are different things that are here. The first thing is the timeline. And there is the media and the Americans and the Israelis want us to believe that this started on the 7th of October. This didn't start on the 7th of October. I can name countless of incidences of at the beginning of the establishment of Israel by the Jewish militias who completely ethnically cleansed towns. Those are self-confessed. There are documentaries of the perpetrators speaking what they did back then in the 40s to the Palestinians, completely annihilated and burned down Palestinian towns. This didn't start on the 7th of October, but when we see what happened from the 1948 till today, yes, both sides resorted into violence. Then we can say, but both sides were aggressive, or both sides were committing this and that. But the main root of the cause of this is that the Jewish people, they used to live in Palestine freely and in peaceful terms between with the Arabs, with the Christians, with the Muslims. There were no problem. There was no anti-Semitism in the Middle East. The anti-Semitism is an idea from Europe, and they exported it to the Middle East, and they projected it on the Middle Eastern people. This problem with the Israelis, between the Arabs and the Israelis, is not because they are Jewish people. It's because it's an occupation force. And if they were Hindu who came to Palestine and they took somebody else's land and they made it their home, it would have been a problem between this people and the Hindu people there. And then they would have said, we have a phobia from the Hindus. No, that's not the case. The main issue, the direct issue, is that there is an occupation. Like what would be my problem as a Christian Orthodox with the Jewish people? Zero problem. I have my very good friends are Jewish, they're anti-Zionist, and we can hang around, and there's we don't even speak about religion. Like, we don't care what is your religion. As long as you treat me well, I treat you well. But Israel occupies my Golan Heights, so I have a problem with the Israeli side that they occupy our territory. This is an issue of a territory. It's not about religion, but Israel tries to depict it as a religious war because they can garner international support and sympathy because of the real anti-Semitism that prevailed for centuries in Europe. And the Jewish people went through hell for centuries, and they were persecuted, and they were massacred, and they were ethnically cleansed. And in the 40s, millions of Jews perished because of anti-Semitism, but it wasn't us who did it. It's not you cannot commit the crime and then come and accuse us of being an anti-Semite. This is the issue with me.
I think a lot of people see it very sad that the oppressed are now the oppressors. And that's what's the flip has happened in history. But I wanted to ask you kind of a twofold question that includes Syria. That is the question about October 7th. So why October 7th? Now I have my theories about this, and you can agree or disagree, and we can parse that out. But there's a lot of gas reserves right off the coast of the Gaza Strip. So beyond territory, there's energy reserves worth almost $1 trillion. And you have, of course, oil reserves, not as many, but few. And then you have, of course, all the oil reserves in Syria, which America has basically just confiscated a third of the oil reserves, if that's correct number, in Syria, and is bombing and being quite aggressive with Syria right now in just recent weeks alone. On top of that, Bibi was not very popular in Israel recently. As a few months ago, there was massive demonstrations within his own country to get him ousted. But America is very concerned, and America and Israel are quite intertwined, about the energy, economic, and all of that, and positioning also, which militarily, of the Gaza Strip and all of the riches that are there. Plus, on the other hand, you have the East, the BRICS summit, which is moving well, and you have the Silk Road coming through, right? And so you have the East uniting and the Arabs uniting with the East, dumping the dollar, and there's a shift of wealth. So it's part of this, what I'm just laying out for you, or is it something different? And can you kind of explain it a little bit more?